Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda Carney. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda Carney. I'm sure you know me by now. And this week, we're following on our how-to series, which I'm not sure if you've heard the previous ones, where I'm revisiting topics that have been really popular, that I've had lots of questions on, and trying to really bring them up to date or consolidate ideas and best practice that are practical for you in quite a succinct way. Now, the whole idea of rethinking your appraisal is not new. The appraisal, I'd say, or review process is probably one of the most maligned in HR's group of things that we do, and one of the things that people complain about the most. I think it was about 12 years ago when there was lots of publicity saying that GE or Adobe, etc., were ditching the annual review process because it wasn't working. And they were moving on to a more continuous process. And that's a very interesting one because the apparent motivation for that was to reduce the amount of management time spent going through the performance review. But the reality is, to go to a more continuous process, actually managers probably need to spend more time managing. And the evidence, if you want to look at the evidence of what drives high performance, which is one of the main reasons for a performance appraisal, although you could argue that currently other key areas like loyalty, well-being, retention are different, more important priorities, then maybe that's one of the things where talking to people on an ongoing basis, undoubtedly that's what the evidence of the last 50 years illustrates, that having regular conversations, setting clear goals regularly and giving feedback is the best way to help people to perform. So, and to do that, it doesn't work once a year. It doesn't work twice a year. It probably doesn't work quarterly. It's something that should be going on a regular basis. It's a style of people or performance management. Anyway, that's the kind of history. These are things I've talked about before. And incidentally, I will put in the show notes where I've talked about this topic previously, so I'm going to aim not to make this too repetitive. There will be things that I've covered previously that I'll touch on. But what I wanted to do is really just look at this maybe where we've talked about being more strategic, as we did in the earlier podcast. If your organisation is saying, we need to fix appraisals, appraisals are broken, or we need to do things differently, how do you respond to that? And I think that's the key to be aware of, because it's very easy to criticise something and say, oh, that's got to change or that's got to go, but we don't necessarily always get good answers as to what it should be replaced with. So what I'm going to discuss in this podcast is I'm going to just identify or remind you of the sort of things that make a review or performance management process, talking about it in terms of managing performance or developing high performance and retention as opposed to managing underperformance, the sort of things that make that kind of process work. I'll talk about some of the dependencies culturally that you can't change things without considering. And sometimes because of these dependencies, organisations try to change things without realising why it's broken in the first place, i.e., the review process is blamed when actually the issue is the fact that managers don't have enough time or motivation or the skill to manage people effectively. And most importantly, I think in terms of the fresh thinking, I want to make some suggestions that you could use in order to consult back into your organisation. If they're saying, I want to change this, rather than you running off and saying, right, it's got to be changed, they're definitely right, and I'm going to go and fix it, helping you to think about how you can really challenge that and come up with the right solution for your organisation, and not take it at face value that actually it does need to change, in fact. So, first of all, why do people hate appraisals? Well, it's typically because they're backward looking. Managers feel like they're going through the motions. No one can remember what you did last week, let alone last year. In a hybrid world, do we even see what people are doing? The relevance isn't there. Plus, also, because we're relatively poor at delivering feedback, possibly even more so in a hybrid world, it becomes very stressful, emotional, depending on how skilled your manager is. It can feel like the feedback is overly critical or non-specific. So the point is, people don't like them, but all of those things that I've described are not the fault of an appraisal. They're generally the fault of the way it's been designed, i.e. it's too complex, the questions are too backward looking, it's too infrequent, or it's badly delivered. So those are the actual problems. So this is where we have to be careful to understand and unpick what the problems are. Now, on the balance to that, what actually has been consistently proven to drive high performance? And as I said earlier, high performance is one thing. I mean, we need people to perform for businesses to survive, but equally we need to retain and support people, particularly in this climate, for them to be able to perform. So you could argue that the purpose of a performance management process needs to shift at the moment, or it needs to do both. So it's really, whereas previously it might have been all about just getting numbers and putting people into 9-box grids and getting performance ratings, maybe in this environment, that's a very sort of task or performance focused sort of setup. And maybe during the pandemic, it was all about well-being, recognition, support, that sort of thing. Probably what we need to think about right now in this more hybrid environment is something that takes into account both. Depending on how things progress with cost of living crisis and things like that, and business challenges, this is the interesting thing. The cost of living crisis and all the emotional fallout of post-pandemic and recession, that's going to affect people personally, but it is also affecting businesses. Businesses don't have the money, even if they wanted to give people massive pay rise, they don't have the money to do that. People are struggling to pay to heat their homes, want to work remotely, don't want to pay to come into the office, don't want to pay to heat their homes. There's loads of conflicting challenges out there. So the sense is really that we have to make sure that we've got both a task and a people focus. And actually that is the only sustainable way forward. You can swing one way or another if you think about it in terms of what's the purpose of your performance management process. Is it about people focus as in retention, engagement, career progression, development, talent management, or is it about driving high performance, being more profitable, productive, etc.? Well, you need both because they feed each other. You can lean one side or another in seesaw for a period of time, but you always have to swing to the other way. And again, being aware of that whole swinging aspect is, well, maybe if you had them both in balance, you can't see my hands, but I'm very much showing a sort of seesaw here. If you designed a process that actually balances both people and performance, maybe you wouldn't need to change it. Maybe you would, but it's always needs freshening. Things always need freshening up. Maybe you've got new values, new leadership, new competitors. Things can need changing for very good reasons. But it's interesting just to take a step back and think, what is it that we need to do? So if you are in an organisation and you're new in, or people are saying something's not working, we need to change it, and the process or the appraisal form is the issue, what do you do? Now, very often, as you know, I work in this area, so I regularly talk to HR professionals who'll come and say, we want to move to a continuous performance management process. Fine, okay. So what exactly do you want to do? What does that look like? Why do you want to do that? I would want to know those questions, because obviously that actually is really important if you're configuring a system. And it's interesting because quite often they don't know. So if you're in this position where people are saying we need to change something, my suggestion, and this links back to our previous podcast on being strategic, is rather than rushing off saying, right, I'm going to go find the solution, work with your organisation to help them give you more information or gain more clarity about it. So going back to my earlier point that sometimes it's almost shooting the messenger. The appraisal isn't the issue, it's actually the way it's being carried out. So because you can say, no problem, we're going to ditch appraisals altogether and we just go on to an ongoing conversation, or we're just going to talk to people all year round, we don't need any structure in place. What would happen if you did that? You said, fine, we're just ditching appraisals, nothing on. As an HR professional, have you got any information to know how people are managed? Have you got any information to be able to go and develop people, understand what their development needs are, or who the key skills are that you want to retain and develop in the organisation? How do you know whether people are getting feedback or not? You can say, oh, go and do ongoing conversations, leave managers to it. The reality is everybody is so busy and a very small percentage of people will actually do something like that. That's a reality, because it's always easier, unless you're a very dedicated people manager, it is always so much easier to focus on the day job over and above people management. So your organisation is saying, right, we need to change it. What can you do about that? Well, I would say you need to go and talk to people and say, okay, so what is it that you actually dislike about the current situation? What specifically is it? And is it the form? Is it a 10-page form which asks backward-looking questions that everybody hates? Is it the time of year? Because when you're expecting everybody to do it, it's when it's year end, or they're trying to do other things, and it's an unrealistic time of year. Is it that they just don't feel confident? They don't have the skills doing it? Is it that they basically don't want to be a person, don't like managing people, they don't see the value, or they should really be in a role which is an individual contributor, they're not motivated? Maybe they don't see the value or link between having those conversations and engagement, or maybe they just don't understand how important their role is as a people manager. So if you don't understand what it is they actually dislike, then you may end up fixing stuff which isn't the problem. So you can initiate a new process, but if fundamentally people are not motivated to manage, it's not going to make any difference at all. And unless you drag them, then they're not going to do it. You can just say, oh, go off and do your own thing. If they're not motivated, then they go, hurrah, no more appraisal. But it's not going to make them do any more. So find out what people actually perceive as the problem is, to make sure that you are fixing the right thing and not focusing on the appraisal form or the process or the timing. Find out what the actual problem is and check that it isn't a bit of a red herring. And then also I'd ask the follow-up question and say, okay, so what would you like instead? And if they say, oh, I just don't want to do that, I think you should just leave me to it. Well, what are the implications of that? It might be fine for 6 months, but what's going to happen long term? And if you think about it, if we don't talk to people over the long term, then their loyalty, particularly in a hybrid environment, is going to reduce. Their affinity to the organisation, potentially their likelihood to leave, is going to increase. Maybe their morale's going to drop down. They're not getting any feedback, or they'll just become more of plodders. You're not going to optimise what you're getting out of them. So thinking about what are the implications of not having these conversations or changing this altogether. Ask them, okay, so if we took this process out altogether, how would you like us to allocate promotions or reward? And people might say, oh, a blanket cost of living increase. Fine. Okay, so what about a high performer versus a low performer in your team? And they might say, well, I want to pay the high performer more. If you're not having regular conversations, you've got no data, how is that going to be fair? How would that make the high performer feel if everybody's getting the same thing? And if you aren't carrying out some sort of process, if you have no data trail, you could expose the business potentially if you're rewarding people unequally. So you could leave yourself open to tribunals. So helping them see the implications of not doing it. That's the key, really. So helping people come up with the solutions rather than you in your role as HR professional feeling you've got to rush off and go, actually, will this do it for you? Really act as a consultant and explore what the real problem is in their eyes and what the solutions might be. And if they are being idealistic, which is based on hating something for the sake of it, ask them what the consequences could be. What are the risks of taking something away? And listen, sometimes that's all you need to do. That's the really funny thing. Maybe you don't need to change anything, or you just need to tweak the form or change the language a bit, make it a bit more positive, a bit more forward looking. And the process is fine as it is. It just needs to be done better. Maybe they need some skills training. So don't feel you've got to throw the baby out with the bathwater is really what I'm saying. So what I'm going to focus on now is what does work in performance management. And this is based on evidence that we asked an external psychologist to research for us. It's about 3 or 4 years old that they did the research, but it was over the last 50 or 60 years. So it's all pretty relevant and effective. And you will have heard me mention this many, many times, but the thing that comes down more and more often is that ongoing goal setting and feedback of people's progress, both critical but also supportive. So constructive feedback about how people are doing against the goals is really, really important. And that is what's very motivational to people. And an absence of that means that people drift and they lack motivation. So whatever your process, you need to have some level of goal setting. And I guess if you're going to go to a continuous process without any kind of formal appraisal, then you could just have an ongoing goal setting and feedback process. However, if you're going to do that, there needs to be some way in which you can assimilate that information. Probably you need to ensure that check-ins or one-to-ones are actually happening, and managers don't just pay lip service to it because it doesn't happen on its own. So that's definitely a really important thing. However, in this current climate, in this day and age, other things are really important as well, possibly more important. The whole concept of development. People want development. They want opportunities for development and growth. They want to feel coached as opposed to told what to do. And they want to participate. So it needs to be two-way. And the other thing they want is they want to have an opportunity to feel they're progressing. So if your one-to-ones are just about goal setting and feedback, unless the managers are naturally inclined to coach and develop and access development and encourage people to do development, they may become a little bit task orientated. And I would recommend, therefore, that you can suggest a process that doesn't have to have appraisal in it. Appraisal can be useful because it basically summarizes everything at the end of a year, and it can be a good opportunity for you as HR to get that data through. But just making sure that the process has different purposes per one-to-one. And again, this sounds like I'm very dictatorial, I guess, prescribing what should happen. However, I'm quite experienced, and I know that if you don't prescribe what needs to happen, you are talking about culture change. People are different out there. We know we've got managers who don't necessarily want to manage, who've never had any training in management, who've got conflicting actions and priorities. And these things just won't happen unless you do prescribe them to a certain extent. One of the other things that you could include to freshen up your process is feedback on behaviours and things like 360 feedback. I'm not a fan of 360 feedback for whether someone is performing, i.e. achieving their goals, because I think that should be something that's obvious from the point of view that it's a SMART objective that you've achieved or not. But 360 feedback can be really helpful to ensure that your line managers are more self-aware about their management style. So they may think that they're great, but actually they're not doing things regularly. You can introduce it as a development for your managers, and you could also introduce it for other individuals in terms of the competencies that are relevant for their role. And what's quite nice about something like 360 feedback, where you're getting multi-rater feedback, is in this hybrid work environment where we're not necessarily seeing the same people day in, day out. It gives a more objective view of how our performance is perceived from people who we may not talk to. So people that we're working with, my boss might not see me very often, but I'm working with lots of other people in a virtual fashion. If I get 360 feedback from those, then that becomes a more balanced way for my manager to be able to give me feedback and for me to build my self-awareness about how I'm progressing. So overall, in terms of whatever process you decide, whether it is ongoing, whether it has an appraisal in it or not, but don't chuck it out just for the sake of it, I actually think you do need to make sure you have something that has specific touch points with purpose throughout the year. So it needs to cover performance, it needs to cover coaching and development. The style needs to be future focused. It needs to be something which has shared ownership between the individual and the manager, so it's not just driven by the manager. And you can enhance self-awareness by including things like 360 feedback in it to help managers realise when they think they're doing a good job, whether they're actually doing a good job. So those are useful tools that you could use. However, there are always the same 3 dependencies. So whether you decide to change or refresh your existing approach, and this all depends on what you perceive the problem to have been, there are 3 dependencies in my opinion. One is how consistently whatever approach it is that you've got is actually applied. The second one is manager's skills and motivation. And the third one is the levels of visibility and your ability to act on the results. So the first one, and this is probably the main reason why people get don't like something, or they change it again so it doesn't work. If it isn't applied consistently, or if managers are carrying out performance management or appraisal in an inconsistent way, then people are going to have problems with it. And that's where, for me, the solution has to be you have to define something, give clarity about what this process is. So what is a good check-in or one-to-one? How many do you expect people to have throughout the year? How many, what's a normal number of objectives? When should people talk about development? If you leave it completely fluid, the reality is nothing will happen for 80%, I would say. Whereas if at least you define what good looks like, then you give people something to aim for and you have a greater chance of consistency. So the problem is often that you don't have consistency. If you were just to embed even your existing process and make it more consistent, you could ask yourself, do we even need to change anything? Could we just change a bit of wording and make it, ensure that it's implemented more consistently, and that might solve your problem. The other thing that might solve your problem is how it's being carried out. Do the managers have the skill and motivation to do it? And I talked about that on earlier in this episode. Helping managers see that it's a core part of their role. When I was working in large organisation years ago, 20 odd years ago, we set every manager an objective to carry out a certain number of one-to-ones and to do certain people management behaviours. And by setting it as an objective, it made it very clear that that was a key part of their role. So do your managers understand it's important? Do they have the right skills, confidence and motivation to manage effectively? If you don't, then you're not going to get very far. And the third one is, have you got the ability to see what's going on? If you just leave people to it, how do you get to identify group training needs? And we know that responding to training needs is really motivational. A great complaint that I would regularly hear in organisations, particularly with really long appraisal forms that right at the end say, what's your next step? What do you want? What job's your ideal? So they have sort of career planning right on the last page, but it's all on a paper document or a SharePoint document. So the HR or OD people can't get that information out. So people say, well, I've been writing that for the last 5 years. What's the point? And of course, I can understand that. So you do need to make sure you've got some way of gathering that information, whether it's a system that makes it really easy for you. You can pull real-time reports. If not, you need to get people to send that information in or find a way to pull it out of these forms or to do it as a part of a specific time of year to make sure that you have visibility of what people's career aspirations are, their development needs, and you're able to act on them. People will see much more value in a process if something comes of it. And again, that's one of the challenges. If nothing comes of it, then that doesn't motivate people. So with any process, new or existing, those 3 dependencies will be the same. It's not an easy option. It's about culture change. So, or embedding the right culture. You need to think always, if you're going to try and change something like this, is how can I ensure consistency across the board? Have our managers got the right skills and motivation? And what can I do to show it's valuable? How can I get the visibility and act on any results that come out of this so that it seems to have a purpose? And remembering that, part of the purpose is driving performance of the business, but part of the performance is retention and development of the people you're aiming this at. So hopefully that followed. I've got a bit of a cold today, so I don't know whether I'm as clear. I feel a bit of a muggy headed, so apologies if it's come over like that. Really what I was trying to say is, rather than redesigning your appraisal, and actually I have got a specific approach that you can take to embed a year-round people and performance process. It's a previous podcast, so I'm not going to go through it again now. And I've also done webinars on this. So we'll put links in the show notes if you want to go into more detail about how you might do this or a design style that might work. This was more about the principles and how you might challenge your business rather than take it at face value that you need to make a change. So to summarise, first of all, don't just take it at face value and rush off and feel you've got to change things or get a new system or whatever just because people have said that they don't like it. Ask what they dislike about it specifically, and also ask what they would replace it with and what the implications might be of replacing it in a certain way. So work with your organisation, don't just to challenge them right back, and understand what the problem really is. Is it the process or is it something else? Then we talked about what you would always want to make. If you want to tweak something, what do you want to make sure your new process includes? Make it future focused, make it about ongoing goal setting and feedback. You could include 360 feedback, particularly in a virtual world, because that gives people a wider perspective, in terms of, and also as a line manager, if you're not working with someone regularly, it gives you a view which is outside of your own, which may be more accurate and up to date. Make sure that any process gives the opportunity for managers to coach people and gives career opportunities, development and growth, and ensure there's a shared ownership around it. And whatever you do, whether you stick with your old process or start a new one, these key things are always going to be important. Is it consistently applied or implemented? Manager skills and motivation as to how they're going to do it, and your ability to act on the results and show value. So can you see the information or not? So I hope that's useful. There's loads of other information on this, as I said, than previous podcasts that you may or may not have heard, because they probably go back about a year and a half ago. And those links will be in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in this week to the HR Uprising podcast. I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.